So before I start, I just want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land from where I'm speaking. I'm in Melbourne, and so I'm on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And just to acknowledge elders past, present, and emerging, this land was never ceded. As Daniel said, I started working as a nurse with HIV positive people at the end of the 80s at Fairfield Hospital, which some of you who are from Melbourne will remember well. And since then, I've worked both. I trained as a family therapist along the way purely because we were having such sort of intense conversations in these early days that I felt sort of inadequately equipped to be able to answer some of the questions, which were very much around what we're going to be talking about today, around the philosophy of illness and existential questions that people were grappling with, having received a diagnosis for an illness which really didn't have any effective medication treatment. And everybody who was working in that field at the time will remember it was the blind leading the blind very frequently and very often. So that's the reason I trained as a family therapist. I'm going to talk, these are some of the things I'm going to talk about today. It's really not a particularly academic talk from the point of view is I'm just going to provide some of my own reflections and insights, and hopefully people will be able to ask questions at the end. I'm going to talk about some of the specific challenges that face people accompany an HIV diagnosis. I want to talk a bit about some family of origin influences, because the way we've been brought up will always have some bearing on how we are and how we live with illness in any form or fashion. I'm going to talk about well-being and connection, and also towards the end, some of the philosophical ways that might be helpful to think about living life well with any illness, but with HIV in particular. And then we'll be able to ask some questions at the end. I meant to move someone. Yes, we can have the slide after that one, please. I think I meant to say next. So can we have the one after this next? This is Havi Carel is a philosopher, a British philosopher, and she has been diagnosed with a chronic illness, and she talks about illness as that it interrupts our plans, it forces us to confront our mortality, and it challenges our sense of who we are. So I think those three sentences or statements actually really sort of can encapsulate what illness means to anyone who's diagnosed with any sort of illness at all. I have the next slide, please. Thank you. So illness has always been and always will be a part of the human condition. It's something none of us can avoid. Hopefully, we're all going to become unwell if we haven't already been unwell in the past. So it will most likely cause some sort of major disruption in our lives. And it brings us face to face with our own mortality. It can turn the world upside down. I remember one of my patients or clients talking about how it was like someone had turned the whole of his filing cabinet upside down. And that's how he experienced this diagnosis with HIV. But then he noted that what was helpful about that, not helpful, but what was helpful was that he was then able to eventually when he decided to, was able to start putting things back, and he realized that some of the things that were in the filing cabinet he no longer needed to have in the filing cabinet anymore. And I think that might be quite a good metaphor for how it might seem to lots of people on receiving a diagnosis of HIV in particular. So it really can focus people, it brings you face to face with your own mortality. but it also can lead people to search for a deeper meaning in their lives. And yeah, it looks how you begin to look at the more when I talk about deeper meaning, I mean the things that are really important to you. It'll shape your values. It'll make you look at the relationships that you have, the ones that you might need to discard, the ones that you might want to change. And just in general, it makes you look at your whole outlook on life, brings things into a much sharper focus. Next slide, please. Thank you. So what any illness does is focus our thoughts on our health, and it invites us to question how we live and why we live the way we do, and also to think about what you might want to do, what I might want to do with the time I have left, or whatever that might be. You might have made assumptions that you're going to work full time, get a terribly big house, and travel a lot and climb Kilimanjaro and all these sorts of things. But actually, when you get a diagnosis like of any illness, that it brings all those values and assumptions that you might have had about your life and how you wanted to live your life into some sort of different sort of focus, and makes you think differently. Doesn't necessarily change everything, but it makes you evaluate things that are important and things that are less important, and what you want to change and what you really need to change about the way you live your life. I think it can also destroy some of our life expectations, but at the same time, it also can present us with an opportunity to create something else in our lives that's meaningful. Next slide, please. When we're talking about illness and specifically around HIV, there's always, there is very much in my experience that HIV has got some very specific challenges, and there's a historical context that will always be relevant. Were any treatments available? I can see a few of the people here today that when they were diagnosed, they would have been confronted not only with being told that their life would have been foreshortened in some significant way, but also that there was very little that the medical profession could offer in the way of treatments. And thinking, what were those circumstances like for you? Everyone will have a different experience and a different story attached to their diagnosis. If you acquired HIV sexually, then that in itself would have been relevant. Was it a regular partner? Was it a new partner? Was it an unknown partner? All these things will very much shape how you receive the diagnosis and how you manage it. There was also at that time, and there still is, a huge amount of fear and shame around the diagnosis. And when I think about, people also got very angry about it, either directing it at themselves for having slipped up and done something that they wouldn't normally do in a sexual arena, and then there was also often some blame attached to either people blaming the other party or blaming themselves for having done something that they wouldn't necessarily, it might have been a little bit out of character, having one extra drink or whatever it could have been. So these are some of the features of living and experiencing this diagnosis, which I think are very specific for HIV. There's also the stigma attached to the diagnosis, whether it was just from society in general, as well as there was, in my recollection, there was stigma within the gay community itself around the people who were diagnosed with HIV and the people who hadn't been diagnosed with HIV. And again, the unpredictable nature of the disease was really made it such a difficult thing to manage that no doctor or anybody was able to say, this is what you can expect will happen next. Everybody was going to have an experience that would be different from their friends and the other people around them. And we bear witness to that today when you think about the people who you've lost and the people you've known who haven't survived into the into the 2020s. They often, so many people didn't survive at all. So, and then just touching on internalized homophobia, I think that can have an influence on particularly on people's mental health. If there was some degree of stigma that well, internalized homophobia that people were experiencing, then this directly would have a negative effect on people's mental health. Next slide, please. Well done. I just want to talk briefly as well as a family therapist about how illness was managed in your family of origin. Because, you know, were you someone who was mollycoddled and wrapped up in cotton wool when you had a sort of bit of a sniffle and popped into bed with a hot water bottle and things? Or were you someone who was packed off to school and, you know, your parents were working and you really had to be out the house because how could anyone stay at home and look after you? Because they were both family members were off, you know, were going to work. Did you grow up in a family where a family member was unwell, and did you have, you know, perhaps a mum who took to her bed and you always had to play quietly? All these sort of influences can have an impact on how we all respond to illness in the here and now, currently, presently. There are also cultural issues, which I think are important to bear in mind with regard to people's attitudes to sex, to sexuality, to drug use. How do people talk about gay people? And if there were some really negative statements made about gay people, what impact did that have on you as you were growing up in your family of origin? The same goes for people who just sort of talked about people who inject drugs in a very negative fashion, as if they were some sort of sub-race. And I think often that can really have a very negative impact on people. It sort of comes in very subtly into how people respond to illness and how people respond to an HIV diagnosis in particular. And again, the whole, you know, did your family know you were gay before you were diagnosed? This will have some sort of impact. What was the whole experience of coming out like for you? Did that, you know, was that sort of accepted by your family of origin, or were you somehow, did you have to sort of hide your experience of coming out and make sure people weren't aware of your emerging sexuality, etc.? Next, please. So looking at this from a philosophical perspective, you know, how might a philosophical approach or outlook be helpful? I think first and foremost to acknowledge that we're more going to die, and but what a philosophical approach might help us with is that it can help us focus on what really, really matters, the really important things, and ask ourselves questions like, you know, what do I want my life to stand for? What do I want to do with my life, rather than, you know, what do other people want me to do? I think some people, you know, they might have, you know, in our family, everyone's a doctor, had that sort of story, but actually the person involved just never wanted to be a doctor, felt quite unwell when they sort of saw any blood or anything like that. So it could have a really positive effect on how people lived their lives and what they did with their lives. It also provided a different sort of perspective on how to live a good life, and provided some insights. And I think these were really helpful parts of having been given this diagnosis. It also focused you on things like, are there relationships I want to repair? Are there relationships I want to discard? So this sort of thing would, a diagnosis of this illness would often, not that you'd wish it on anyone, but act actually as a positive force in the long term. I'll go to the next slide. Another different thing about HIV, I think, is who you decide to share your diagnosis with, and how you decide to do this. I think, okay, everyone, we've all got private info. We all tend to keep information about our health quite private. But the costs and the benefits of disclosing or sharing your diagnosis with other people, I think, are more acute when we talk about HIV. So how do you decide to tell people? And this is an ongoing thing. It's not like just once I've told one set of people, that's the end of the story. This is something that I imagine you're doing all the way through your life with HIV. You have to constantly weigh up the pros and the cons, whether you're talking to a new partner, a new sexual partner, or whether you're talking to work colleagues, or whether you're going to talk to anyone at all. You have to sort of juggle around with, do these people need to know? And when you did decide to tell them, were they gay, or did they have HIV as well? Also, the past reactions that people have had to when you have told them will have an ongoing impact on how you decide to tell someone else. Because if you've had a negative response, then it's going to automatically colour how you make decisions about telling someone else in the future. And that in itself, I think, is important to pay attention to, or to recognise, because it isn't a straightforward and easy thing to tell people, whether they are someone you want to be intimate with, or whether they're someone that you work with as a colleague, or a new friend, or whatever it might be. What I do always say, though, or think, is that on the whole, sharing your diagnosis will increase your connection with other people. And that in itself can be a really important thing, particularly for your mental health. And we know very much that our mental health is connected with our physical health. And so I'm not saying everyone must tell everybody, but I think making a consideration of who you tell and how you tell them, when you tell them, is important. We'll go to the next slide. I think the importance of connecting and being connected to others is always terribly important. First and foremost, you need to have a good doctor who you can trust, and who knows how to manage and treat HIV, as well as can send you in directions where you can see other people who know their stuff as well. So someone that you can trust, the more people you have who you can trust, I think, is really important. Having knowledge, and here you are, all of you have come up to on a Wednesday afternoon to this workshop. This is a way of sharing knowledge and experience with other people, keeping up to date with the latest, and the latest, whether they're trials, whether they're workshops, whether they're events that are happening in the community. All this is really important. So keeping up to date is really a useful thing, and to increase your networks with other people in the sector, I think, can be a positive thing as well. I'll go to the next slide. Just want to talk briefly about well-being in illness. How do we achieve this? Some people automatically will talk about, especially doctors, will want to talk about T cells and viral load counts. But actually, I think thinking about it, coming at any health issue from a more holistic approach, can be really helpful. This is one part of me. It's not all of me. It does not define me. And thinking sort of through those sort of statements can often be useful in helping us to separate what are the most important things, and what's important to me and what do I want to do. And this virus does not define me. What really matters to me, and that's always going to be a philosophical question and query. The next slide, please. This Javi Carrell, I've got her referenced at the end, and there's a podcast that she does, and she, as I said before, she's is living with a chronic illness. This quote I think is very beautiful. She says, "Delineate a place in the present where you're not plagued by regrets about the past and anxieties about the future, and you can be happy in this place." And I think that sort of almost again encapsulates a lot of what the challenge is that we're faced with when faced with a diagnosis of a chronic illness. Just go to the next slide. These are some philosophical ways of living. Gosh, when I Googled philosophical ways of living, there's a whole heap of stuff that I could do a whole talk on that possibly, or maybe not. But the ones that I found most useful were the Stoics, the school of Stoics, who focus on what we can control and accepting what we can't. I think this is a really helpful way of managing stress and uncertainty and setbacks that confront us in life. The existentialists, they very much talk about having free will. We can make deliberate choices and we can create meaning in adversity. I think that's the existentialists had a pretty clear idea of what makes sense to them, and a philosophical way of living which gave them their lives meaning. And again, now, I don't think this is a philosophical school, but mindfulness, we talk about this a lot, and nowadays sort of it basically tries to encourage you to live in the present moment and bringing your sort of whole awareness into the now, and sort of banishing that temptation to race down ghastly pathways of doom and destruction. And I think that having a mindful approach, which people will often talk about, just being in the present moment, really noticing the sight, bringing your awareness to all your five senses, like sight and touch and the rest of them. This is a useful way of living life, and it prevents you from going down the corridor into being fearful and distracted by life and what it presents to you. So this is the end of my talk. This is what I've covered, and I hope we've got some time now for some questions. So thank you very much for listening.